I mean, it just follows this.
Sorry, we did the broadcast. Yeah, we all done.
I need it now.
Yeah.
Because their expectations are set
Yeah.
at this. And so. Oh, yeah. I know, it's. All of them. I'm not moving. We agreed.
Oh, here's. Bring all my friends once today. Hey. She said you were new around here. Oh, it's. Did you?
She didn't know, I guess. She was telling me.
Oh, thanks so much.
No.
He's one. You sure?
I did 72. Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But it didn't go that.
The next subject. Now today. A friend of mine is so it's crazy, right? It's like rednecks. Really nice.
And I'm like,
Oh, yeah, I've been. But I'm gonna start. No. Well, then. Putting it on.
no, I don't think they're doing. We didn't buy it. No. So we got. But-
Thank you. Everybody have material? Back, you got the material? Yeah. Okay. Are you ready? Any questions? Through. You ready? No questions? We're good. One of the exciting things about real estate is there's always one more thing. There's always another variable. It's always one little extra, I went through the transaction, having a conversation, with one of our agents got a situation. We've been talking about 10 minutes, going through the thing. And then she just kind of, by the way, we represent the buyer and the seller. Sure, but nice to know that right up front, when we're still working on. Oh, okay. Sorry. No problem. Sure. So there's always, and I had this is the first time I've had this question. I'm not gonna actually go through it. It's not part of what we're talking, but it deals with some of the concepts that we work through. And so. And we did actually represent both in this case, but it's done right, two different agents. So we got seller who's in a seller temporary residential lease and is going to be there for a couple more months. And the buyer who now owns the property is going to sell it, wants to sell it. And the seller's, okay, not a problem, on board with that. So the question I want you to play around with a little bit, and we'll maybe talk about the next slide, whatever. So right now, the buyer, who's the landlord in the seller temporary residential lease, and the seller, who's the tenant in the seller temporary residential lease, if this buyer / landlord sells it to another person, to another buyer, what's the impact of that on the temporary residential lease? What's the thing about it? There's always one more thing that we have to deal with. Now, let's talk about what you've got materials here. We keep having situations pop up. And fortunately, we had some really great agents who address it and work through it, and we get to think about it and deal with it on the HOA addendum. One, you're aware that they did pass some new laws in the legislature, new as effective September 1st of last year. But there are some changes in the legislature dealing with maximum cost and things like that. Resale certificate maxes out at $375, but updating one maxes out at $75. Our challenge is, though, making sure we understand and the buyer and the seller understand the expenses that are addressed in the transaction with the mandatory HOA and how they're identified in the addendum. And there are two sets here. One, actually, now one is in paragraph A and D. The other is in paragraph C. And you'll actually see the language in paragraph C of the addendum where it says, except as provided by A and D. So in paragraph A, the seller has an expense separate from any expenses we address in paragraph C for the subdivision information, including resale certificate. So we had an unusual transaction in which we had a number, paragraph C, and the concept of that number is to address any charges that are related to, by the HOA, to the fact that there's someone else who's going to own the property now. We don't like to really use the phrase transfer of fees because we address those in the Constitution about 2 legislative sessions back. But it's anything that's a result of that. However, what's not included is the expense the seller agrees to in paragraph A1 for the subdivision information and the resale certificate. So in that particular transaction, for whatever reason, the HOA did not have any charges related to the transfer of title. The only charges they had were related to the resale certificate, which is owed by the seller in paragraph A1. Has nothing to do with the number in paragraph C. However, if we've got a number in paragraph C that we feel like covers the cost that the seller will have in that transfer of title, then the buyer's going to pay that amount, seller pay whatever's less, whatever's over that. And if there's anything over that, fine. But if the HOA doesn't charge anything, and paragraph C doesn't relate to anything, paragraph C doesn't count. The number of paragraph C is not relevant. If the HOA, now, and this is the first time I've seen, this is the first time I've ever heard of an HOA not charging anything, but I'm told in that transaction,
It was
they
right,
didn't.
it was right over here behind the office. It was Preston Meadow.
Yeah,
And so let me ask them the question that I didn't ask yesterday when we were talking.
okay.
What should I have done differently? And they were willing to pay, and it was a nominal
Okay.
fee, so it was fine.
Yeah.
How would I have made it
So it's a great question. So you're the listing agent, you want to identify your seller situation. And you see a little handout here beyond the HOA addendum itself that talks about some of this. So before I get into those questions, it's kind of address Cindy's. As a listing agent, what you're going to do is determine what the costs are to the seller, depending on which choice they accept. A1, 2, 3, or 4. So what are those costs? We then look at the costs associated with paragraph C. And that's the one we normally are concerned with. That's normally you say, oh yeah, resale certificate, that's $375, that's normal, that's whatever. But what we really want to do is find out what's the HOA charging, because some HOAs have terrible fees in dealing with the transfer, which has nothing to do with paragraph A1 and nothing to do with paragraph D. So what we normally do in a listing is we find out what those are as we negotiate what we're going to allow in paragraph C, because we know, that if the buyer will pay this amount, sellers will pay everything else. So we need to know how much it's going to be for the seller. By the way, the buyer's agent should do the same thing. Because if you're trying to negotiate a good offer and minimize what the seller's cost is going to be, if you find out that what the HOA is going to do is charge the seller, they are charged the transfer of this, then the buyer said, okay, I'll cover all that. So they put that number in there. Or they could put 100% in there. Which is fine, right up until Cindy's transaction, they don't charge anything. So what you got to do is help the seller identify, based on the choice and the offer you accept in paragraph A, 1, 2, 3, whatever you choose to do there, let's look at the expense associated with that. Because if it shows an A1, then the expense you've already agreed to, seller, is the subdivision information, primarily the resale check. I mean, that's something you've already accepted, regardless of any other charges in the transaction relating to the transfer of title. So you've got to go through that process and deal with that. Cindy?
So then does item C go towards people that charge those community enhancement fees?
Yes. It's a great question. We don't care what they call it. Community enhancement fee, party every second Tuesday of the week, we don't care. Whatever they call it. Anything associated with the transfer of title one person to the other, that's in this. Now, there's sometimes HOA is charged a prepaid. Well, a prepaid is going to be paid regardless of whether it's a transfer of title or not. That's not included in that. These are only expenses that regardless of how they name them, what they call them, if that cost wouldn't pop up except we've had a transfer of ownership from one person to the other. That's the only reason that fee pops up. If that fee pops up, regardless of what they call it, that's paragraph C. Now, anything else has to be addressed in 1, 2, or 3. So we've got to separate those expenses out. And to protect our sellers, say, okay, by choosing what you've accepted, the offer, here's what you've chosen. 1, here's what you've agreed to pay. And this is what it's going to be. Now, we then go out and find out, Now, I don't know. I wouldn't have thought to do it. But it would be nice for you to know the HOA is not going to charge anything.
Well, so I did call the HOA and they told me it was 100. I mean, I emailed them actually, I'm trying to remember the words in my mind, what it said, but I what the cost of I think I said, what's the cost of transferring, resale certificate, et cetera, and he said it's just $175. And so I knew it was $175, but I thought when they had 250 in C that would cover the $175.
Now we know it doesn't.
Cover any of it.
Now we know it's 2
So
different
then
things.
they should have checked number 2 for us to not have to pay.
Wouldn't matter.
It
So,
wouldn't matter.
yeah, well,
Okay.
and we can look at the other choice here. The key is separating the transfer stuff, paragraph C,
Yeah,
from other expenses that are agreed to primarily because in C, we actually specifically reference to paragraphs A and D. Because D deals with an updated resale certificate.
well, again, it wasn't that much money, which is refreshing.
Well, but it could have been.
because-
I mean, it could have been a couple $1,000.
No,
You know, it
I
could have
didn't
been.
understand why.
Yeah.
I just never
So
understood.
do we understand now the distinction between something that's already been accepted and agreed to by the choice in paragraph 1 as opposed to something that's related to paragraph C? Two different issues. That makes sense, Cindy?
Yes.
And Bob, you
Yes.
requested, maybe it's probably done requested, but it's that covers capitalization.
Yeah.
Development, when sometimes that's.
Okay, so here's the concept of a fee in relating paragraph C. The fee only exists because there's been a transfer of ownership from one person to another. That's the only reason that fee exists. If it exists for any other reason, paragraph C doesn't apply. So only if it's there because of that. Now, if a seller says, okay, I'll provide a resale certificate, well, that's paragraph A. Has nothing to do with paragraph C. Whatever that expense is, seller's agreed he's going to pay it for paragraph A. If you work through. Now, paragraph 2, as you pointed out, the buyer is accepted the fee. Buyer says, yeah, I'll pay for this. There's still a right determination in A2 for the buyer, as they have a timeline for getting in. There's still some little gray areas in there. But if you totally want to get away from the expense to your seller for this information, subdivision information, including resale certificate, then a seller could counter an offer and say, well, I want the buyer to do too, because I want the buyer to pay for all this. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so again, because that was my other scenario that it happened to me, where I knew, again, I told the HOA, I knew that there was a community enhancement fee or capitalization or something, and it said in the bylaws that the buyer pays it.
We don't
So
care.
then when they wrote down, $500 or something in IMC, I thought that was for other things, but because it said the buyer was gonna have to pay.
So you can't go by what the HOA, Cindy, stay with me. You can't, you're not, your buyer, when they're gonna buy a property in Mantua HOA, they need to be familiar with the bylaws, they need to research. The bylaws don't affect contract. It doesn't affect what's being agreed to here. I don't care, we don't care to say, well, buyer pays it. No, we don't care. Now, we occasionally have an HOA says, are you one of those contract bimbos? I've heard about you people. Here's how this thing's gonna close. And if you don't do it like we want you to do it, we're not approving your buyer to live in our national subdivision. So what are you gonna do about that? I'm gonna get a good attorney who likes to sue HOAs. But hopefully it's a nice expensive, so everybody's got a good attorney to do that. But it's a real challenge because they say, yeah, here's the deal, and they call it certain things, thinking that makes a difference. And it does not make a difference. Now, having said that, we've got some smaller title companies who will listen to the HOA and do what the HOA wants them to do. And so you got to be careful. You got to protect your client, work through it. And the best way to do it is before you get to a contract, have some conversations. And if the conversation is say, oh yeah, that's an enhancement fee and the buyer always pays that. You say, well, that's not what the contract says. I've talked to the title company. So what are we gonna do about that? Now, this needs to be something the buyer has a conversation with, and the buyer needs to say, really, do I really want to own a house in the subdivision when you got a Yahoo in charge of it like that? That's a decision you gotta make. Because some of these HOAs, these metro HOAs are small, voluntary, and they have no life outside of this little empire that they've got. That is their life. And some of them, you can't even get in touch with them, and yet they can foreclose on them. It's just a horrendous situation. But it's really important to separate those. Janet?
On number 3, when will the buyer not require a resale?
Not required updated,
Yes,
No.
updated resale.
but frankly, many times. Yeah, in fact, many times buyers don't care at all, but that's what paragraph D addresses. Because if the buyer says, hey, I don't care, I don't want one, title company says, well, we do. And who's going to pay for it? That's why you get 2 boxes of paragraph D. But remember, update resale certificates max 75, and many HOAs don't even charge. So I don't know, I don't have a good rationale for why a buyer wouldn't do it. But if they don't, we have to look at paragraph D and see who's gonna pay for a new one. Does that make sense? Or you still having to think about that?
Seller ordered it ahead of time.
Well, it appears that lenders want it and title company.
Well, what they typically want an updated one is if the original is, I think it's kind of semi pointing out, is so old. And they say, you know, we want a fresher one. We want one that's less than 30 days old. We want an updated. And that's not the buyer saying, that's the buyer's lender or the title company saying, yeah, we want one, and then you have to deal with it. That's okay.
We may not know that prior to writing the offer, or should we ask
Well,
title and lenders? the
Yeah.
question?
yeah, I'll go ahead and ask and find out, you know, we've got an updated resale, we've got a resale certificate. How old is it? Because you should have that in MLS. I mean, you know, you should have that information. Don't you put that in MLS? Why would you not put that? Why would you, if you've got a resale certificate, because that's the only thing that's not recorded public record, you know, you don't put that in MLS?
I've never seen.
All your sell disclosure and all that, why would you not do that?
We don't have it yet.
What do you mean you don't have it?
It's
So
very
you haven't ordered it up yet.
right.
Okay, so you got the listing, you haven't ordered it up, and you won't get it until by sale said, let's wait till we get an offer. Okay, sure, that's fine.
So
Okay, Nick?
Jenna, the scenario would be you go under contract, you get the seller, you go under contract, the HOA gets ordered, title company has it, contract terminates before it actually gets delivered, or even if it does, you now have it. 3 could be buyer hasn't written, but you already have it, so you throw that over there with the seller's disclosure, give everything to the buyer right then, so that 3-day clock starts immediately. And then if they need an updated resale certificate from 7 days later, okay, that's how you
I
address that.
understood the document, the information part, it was just the resale certificate. I was curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's purely lender driven.
Yeah, I would agree. Yes, sir.
I was just gonna say, so in theory, if you have a listing, you could order the resale certificate upfront, put that in MLS. And then that removes the out for the buyer, one less out for the buyer.
Only for, see, remember, resale certificate is only part of it. So not just delivering the resale certificate, what else? The subdivision information as defined in paragraph A. Resale certificate is only part of it.
But when we get the resale certificate, we have all that documentation with it.
Well, has it been delivered to the buyer?
Well, that's what I'm just saying, could you not?
It can't just be in public records, and some of it is a book. I mean, some of it's on drive. So you may not have delivered all of it.
I took care of it.
Pardon me? You got it? Handled? Back row is done. Back row is fixed. We're good. I knew with all the talent I had on the back row, we'd have this thing. Usually I'm on the back row. I can't why they wouldn't. Yeah. I understand it, Larry. It's okay. So we good with the HOA? Let's just really quickly, let's look at this little handout, see if there's anything here that you need to. One, if there's a major HOA in the transaction, must the parties use this addendum? Yeah, yes or no? No, it's not mandatory. You don't have to use it. Parties have, we disclose in the contract, paragraph 6, we disclose, you know, about the major HOA and about 63 about the HOA, the foreclosure on homestead, if you're the risk and all that stuff. But they can use this addendum or another addendum required by the parties. They don't have to use the TREC addendum. You have to present the TREC addendum as an agent. It's a promulgated form, and you have to present that TREC addendum to your client. But they can use something else they want to. So the technical answer, as I heard Nick point out correctly. So, yes, ma'am.
Well, in theory, can't the seller also say they're not going to accept any addendum?
Yeah, the basic contract rule that a seller is not required to accept an offer with any addendum. Or no addenda that a seller said to a buyer, you know what? I want you committed to the nth degree. There'd be no third-party financing, there'd be no contingencies, HOA. There'd be no addendums that give you any outs, period. You're not interested in that, then don't buy my house. And the problem, buyer says, well, but my lender is going to require third-party financing. Well, then find another lender or pay cash. I don't care. So there isn't, the easy thing is there is no addendum. Now I have not actually ever seen a transaction which there were not some addendums. The only exception is not mandatory HOA, it's a cash deal. So in a case like that, you may not have any addendums at all. But in a case where there's financing, it's an HOA. Maybe there's a buyer, a property sale, things like that. We'll see typical normal addendums. That you can do. The only addendum that by law is going to have to be in place is if there's a backup. Got to have a backup contract addendum or a seller can't accept another offer when they already have a contract. So they can't be in two primary contracts. So that's the only thing that they're really going to have. If I'm going to accept this other offer, we need to do something to make sure everybody understands this is an offer that it's a contract, but it's subject to the existence of a first contract. So you'd have to have it in that case. Otherwise, don't have to accept any. So if you'll buy my house, here's the deal. Not only do I want it all cash, I want a really nice briefcase that's got all that cash in it. I want it non-sequentials, hundreds, whatever they want. Now, number two, what is the effect of this addendum on the contract? To use this addendum, one, it creates an obligation to the seller, doesn't it? And it creates rights of the buyer, termination right, depending on the choice you make in paragraph A. Now, if you choose the fourth choice in paragraph A, buyer has no right to termination based on the existence of major HOA. If you check off A4, you're almost certainly going to have to check a box in paragraph D. So I'm going to say, okay, I understand. And it may be totally legitimate. Buyer says, you know what? I'm moving from one area of the subdivision to another. I don't need this information. But I'm a former president. I wrote half the rules anyway, so I don't care. That's okay. 4 is fine, and it creates a more attractive offer because it takes away a contingency that the buyer might have. But you're talking to me, say, okay, that's good, that's fine, but we need a resale certificate. You're going to pay for it. Again, sometimes updated resale certificates, there's no charge at all, so it may not be a big deal at all. Just work through it. 3, why would the buyer use this addendum and what information is the buyer conveying to the seller by using this addendum? Buyer's using it, says, you know what? I've heard about these HOAs. And I want to know, I want information. And then I want an opportunity to review the information, not just a resale certificate, but all the bylaws, all that other stuff. I want an opportunity to look at it. And if I don't like what I see, I want the ability to get out of this deal. So the buyer's saying, yeah, I want certain information here. If I don't get it, I'm not going to buy this house. Number 4, explain the effect of numbers of days in paragraph A1 to the buyer and seller. This blank is a timeline that, one, we're asking the seller in this time frame to provide this information to the buyer. And the buyer has rights of termination once this time frame goes past. So let's say we've got 10 days in there. Once the 10 days passes, whether the buyer has the information or not, once you hit that 10th day, the buyer has 3 days to terminate for any reason, 3 days when they receive it, or 3 days when they don't receive it once this timeline passes. So it creates rights of termination, 3 days or closing, whichever comes first. If the seller finally gets information to the buyer 1 day before closing, buyer has 1 day. You don't get to extend their closing for those days. It says that in the paragraph. So the number of days is important from the standpoint of creating a timeline for the buyer and their termination. And remember, the buyer's rights of termination doesn't have anything to do with what's in the subdivision information. They just woke up that morning and said, I don't know what we were thinking, they're gonna buy that house. Wow, man. Even mobile home moved in next door. What am I doing now? And that's okay, whatever reason they want to use to be able to go through and do that. So, and the number of days also can affect the buyer's offer, because there's a fairly short time frame and the seller doesn't already have it, they haven't already done it, then this may cause the seller to have a rush fee. So I may say, yeah, it's not a better offer than these other offers because they're making me have a rush fee to get to the HOA stuff. So putting too short a time frame in paragraph 4, while that may help the buyer in their rights of termination timeline, it may cause some challenges with attractiveness of their offer. Explain the difference in A2 from A1. A1 is a seller expense, A2 it's a buyer expense. I don't have a really good reason for A2. The buyer, it's the buyer's expense, the buyer gets it, the buyer gets it to the seller. The buyer has an out still, that if they're not able to obtain it through no fault to the buyer within that time frame, then they have a right to terminate once the time frame is passed. The most common reason they can't obtain it is they can't get the HOA, the company to provide the information to them within the time frame. So they've got it there. A3 just deals with an updated resale certificate as you deal with that. What are the possible expenses? We just. We just went through the expenses that we talked about in number 6. What should a listing agent do to help the seller? I think we talked about that, dealing with the expenses and how they relate to based on their choices. And how is it helpful for the buyer's agent to know that the seller's HOA expenses will be as they make a choice, including the amount in paragraph C. I think we just separated out, we've got to identify what the expenses are relating to paragraphs A versus paragraph C. And so A and D are specifically referenced in paragraph C. That makes sense? If you have any further questions about this, Cindy, can I get your cell phone number here? She's gotten some schooling on that. She's really good at it now.
Hey, Bob.
Yes, sir.
Austin, Lawyer's Title supplied us with a nice email that had a bunch of links for HOAs.
Okay, just ones that correct. Okay.
Track website. So thought that was very
Yeah,
helpful
thank you
and,
very much for that.
and so best practices for listing agents, go ahead and try to get as much of that known before you list as possible. That way you'll know how to counter any blanks when it comes to fees and things like that.
Plus, that'll help you in your conversation with the seller, won't it?
Yep, it should.
But I tell you, a lot of these sellers aren't paying attention to what's going on with their HOA. And to be listing it with an agent who knows a lot about it really helps them. Thank you for doing that. Appreciate it, sir. Absolutely. Now, let's go to the next little handout. Bad and better. Which side of that do you want to be on? Better. This is the language challenge. Now, as we get into the language, I want to remind you. And remember, I had a fairly recent, longer than an hour conversation with one of the track investigators. And in a transaction, unfortunately, wasn't anybody here because it was out of the Rockwell office. And one of the really, really important points, she said, Bob, I don't care who originated the language. If your agent lets your client sign off on it, it's their language. So anything that shows up in a transaction, in a contract or an amendment or an addendum, if you let your client sign off on it, your only possible protection is you give your client notice that, you know what? I'm not entirely sure what this does. I don't really understand the language. It's kind of crazy. And we'll see some language in here that's kind of nuts, but every language in here is actually shown up in a transaction. So you say to yourself, I don't know, or your client, I don't know what this means. You need to seek legal advice. You can't make them do it, but you need to advise them on that as you work through it. But Trex is very clear. Any language, both agents are responsible. We don't care who originated. So we need to understand whatever language is in there is your language. So take ownership of it. This just looks at some phrases that are terrible or create some challenges in some cases. Except one in the advertising. Have you ever seen in graphics, good, safe neighborhood? I have. Like every one of these things I've seen in something. What's the risk of that?
That'd be true, obviously, pedophile with the next door.
These people who you represented who buy a house the first week they're there, they're gonna get mugged. Or the house gonna broke, something's gonna happen. I don't know what a good is. I don't know what a safe is. It sounds good. Oh, yeah, good safe neighborhood. In fact, your buyer person said, you know, we're moving from an area, there's stuff going on all the time. We want to get to a good, safe, quiet neighborhood. Well, be careful. Because, you know, they're going to presume that you really know exactly what that means to them and to everybody. So be careful with that. Well maintained, great condition. You didn't inspect the house. You have no responsibility for the condition of the house. Don't be representing anything about the condition of the property. Because anything that you do in representing the condition of the property, that becomes your property. And so when they sue the seller for misrepresenting or failing to disclose, they're going to sue you. They're going to sue you anyway. But they're going to sue you for you representing something about condition of property. This gets into that next thing. New roof this year. Really? That's your roof. You know, what you say, buyer says, well, gee, how old is the roof? And you look at self disclosure notice, and in self disclosure notice, it says they put a new roof on in 2022. And so you say to the buyer, oh, it's a new roof this year, 2022. Bad state. What you say is, here's what the seller says in the self disclosure notice. Here it is. Let's do some research, find out if you lied to us, because they do. We're in one right now that we're this close to a track complaint, in which the buyer says the seller represented that this roof was a couple years old, when in fact this roof was put on in 2014. And the seller kind of represented something because he was using the information from the previous person he bought it from, and saying what he thought had been done, which was just incorrect. So you just, don't say that's a new roof. That roof was put on in 2 years or 5 years or whatever it was. Always source your information. Here's some information. Here's where I got it. Here's what they said. Here's the whatever. You don't get to do it. Media room with surround sound. What's the problem with that phrase? Want to define for me what that means? Even being a high-tech guy like I am. No, it's a good laugh. It's good. I don't know. And is it possible that someone will have a different idea about what's included in a room with surround sound? And when the seller starts taking things, wiring your speakers or stuff like that, it'd be a problem. So you need to be more specific, clear about what it is. And in all your advertising, your pictures, if you show built-ins and if you say things like your graphics, you're representing the buyers that those are going to be included with the property. So you need to be very careful about that. MLS, HOA dues. If you're going to put HOA dues in there, there's a place for it. Make sure it's correct. Especially when you find yourself dealing with some condominium projects, their monthly fees can be significant. And you may put a fee in there and they may think, oh, $800, that's an annual fee. Okay, good. Because they may have come from that HOA, they'd say $800. And then they find out it's $800 a month. Wow. Well, they say, well, that's a lot. Yeah, but look what it covers. There's a gazillion things. Same thing with taxes. As you work through the process, make sure you're properly address exemptions. Square feet in the house, the most important thing about square footage. Even though we have a phrase in MLS, the seller is not representing to the buyer. This is how many square feet are in the property. What the seller is saying, according to this, according to the appraiser, according to Joe down at the CAD office, according to, and what I hate the most is the seller said, yeah, I measured the house, so it's going to the owner. No. So all the seller is saying, according to this source, here's what I say. And then we advise the buyer. We've got a form, it's in our intranet, that you need to have a sense of your buyer. And if you're a buyer, if the square footage is important to you, we've got a form they need to sign off on. We're saying to them, hey, you need to understand you're not buying this house at so much per square foot. By the way, you've been through the house, you look at room size, all that kind of stuff. So the fact that it's 150 square foot difference on this 5,000 square foot house, you can't be using that to file a suit. So you need to make sure we have a sense of it because they're not buying so much square foot. And we've had, not us, but there have been good lawsuits in Texas, in the Dallas area, in which the judge said, no, number one, in one of the cases that Terry Newsom defended the seller on, the judge said, you know what? First of all, the seller didn't sell it at so much per square foot. Second, the property appraised for value as you work through the process. And nowhere in the contract does it address the square footage. Square footage is nowhere in the contract. All we have is a price. And you've got all those disclaimers. And so they ruled in favor of the seller and the buyer lost that situation. In fact, I don't have any examples of lawsuits in our area in which a buyer won in the square footage suit. So you don't have shit.
Bob,
The reason plantation shutters, when trees are in there, is we've had a number of cases in which plantation shutters were described in MLS, and were not left. And that can be very expensive. Sure. Wood burning fireplace, don't presume it's a good wood burning fireplace. It may not be, and if fire expects that to be the case, and you've got a little bit of a challenge you work through. Social media. I support the new initiative to eliminate all social media. That's not in trouble. That's pretty real all of it. In fact, I've got to the point where I don't even respond to a friend request anymore because I keep getting hacked. People keep hacking my stuff and sending out to whatever. That's question. Yes, ma'am. Yeah,
Going next MLS,
yeah.
we as agents need to define what an update and a remodel.
Yeah, updated what?
I showed
Updated, what was the other word?
a remodel,
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
yes.
People have a different opinion of what that means. It's been updated, it's remodeled, it's, always new, and that. People have a different impression of what that means. You see a lot where it talks about great condition, ready to move in. What does that mean? I don't know. So phrases like that tend to be subjective, you're right, you really want to avoid those.
I showed a 1920s home in, on the M streets. And the agent said, I knew this agent, he said completely blown out remodel. And all it was updated, slapped with paint and maybe some cabinets, but it was not a remodel. So we need to remember, stop.
Oh,
using this term.
absolutely.
It's not true.
Physically map food.
So my buyers.
Misunderstood. Absolutely agree. Yep. Second page negotiations. Everybody here who's heard from me in any of their transactions knows how I feel about negotiating with text and emails. Terrible, because people must understand what they think they've agreed to. And they get some point, they think, oh yeah, you do this, I'll do this, I'll do that. Okay, but we got a contract. Terrible. Raises as simple as congratulations. Oh, great, accept our offer, we got to do it. Same thing, done deal. This looks good, my seller will do it. We have an agreement. Your client will do this, we have a deal. Great job, we have a contract. Look forward to working with you. My client says yes. You can't say that because you don't have the authority to bind your client to a contract. Under your agency relationship with the client, you do not have the legal authority to do that. So the concept, and there's a phrase in here, says, based on my last conversation with my client, it appears we're on the same page with the terms of this transaction. However, until all of this is reduced to writing in a promulgated form signed off by all parties and the unequivocal acceptance is communicated to the parties, we do not have a contract. Seller's free to entertain other offers and the buyer's free to go buy a different property. You almost have to say that, because they think, oh, we got a deal, we worked this out, we got a deal, and they tell their buyer gets all excited and their kids get all excited, oh, can we go over and see our rooms again? And all of a sudden you hear from the buyer yelling, what are your sellers doing? Holding our house open. They're holding our house open. We bought it. It's our house. What are you? Not your house. We don't even have a contract yet. Jeez. Additionally,
Bob.
some
Bob.
things that you have in your email that confirm what I just said, we don't have the ability to bind the client. Our signature, our electronic signature doesn't do it. Got to make sure that we work. In the contract itself, on the third page here, clear, yes, question.
Zoom has a question. I think it was.
Okay. Okay, Sally, what you got?
Can you hear me? Bob,
Sally, you there?
Yeah.
Unmute yourself.
Yes.
Hurry up.
okay, can you hear me, Bob?
Sally.
Yes. I've been trying to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah. You should mute, Sally.
Not hear you, Sally.
Okay.
Wait, picture's fiction.
Okay, this goes back, I'm sorry, but this goes back to when we were talking about the square footage.
Can I do the sound here? Anybody know?
I have no idea. Can you? Penny? Can you do the sound here?
Can you type it in, Sally?
Okay, can you hear me?
Look at the bottom right, where yeah, maybe that's slow. Yeah.
It's not just me.
Okay. Well, Janet said you could hear me, so I thought it was okay.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, this goes
Cindy.
back a while because I was trying to ask the question, but no one could hear me.
Okay,
this-
in fact, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
The square footage, this goes back a while to the square footage question. If you have a property that you're going to list and you have an appraisal square footage and a tax square footage that are different, and the tax square footage is higher and you don't have a copy of the appraisal, it just, you know, there is one because it was there before. Can you use the tax square footage on the MLS?
You can use whatever the seller wants that's available. However, if you think there's an appraisal involved, and you've got some number, why do you think that there's square footage from an appraisal? How do you know that? Why do you think that's the case?
Because I sold in the house.
Okay, so did you have an appraisal and you had some of the square footage? So where is it?
I didn't get the appraisal. The lender kept the appraisal.
Okay,
And
so
my clients don't know where
yeah,
it
here's
is.
the seller challenge. If the seller has information that an appraisal, which we tend to look at as more accurate, has a different square footage in it, the seller needs to figure out some way to make use of that. If he can't, if he uses the square footage that the tax roll has, and he puts that in there, maybe he needs to do an extra disclaimer where the seller says, you know, based on the appraisal, when we bought the house, it had a different square footage. We do not have access to that information. So please, buyer, make sure that you verify the square footage, because this is just what the tax roll says. Frankly, we don't think it's right.
Okay, and the tax roll is actually higher. It's only a few square
I
feet.
understand, but still, if it's enough that is significant, is it several hundred?
No, it's like 50 or 60. And in my
Yeah.
mind, every appraisal is kind of subjective anyway, because you know they all come out differently. So,
Not differently enough. We're going to rely on the appraisal unless it's a really unusually constructed house. So I think in this case, particularly if it's not a big deal, the seller could probably use it. The seller needs to prepare to make sure the buyer's agent verifies the square footage. That we're just saying, here's what tax roll says now, and we're not so sure that's true. Because when we bought the house, it doesn't seem to me that that was the right number. So you see, be a little extra careful. That makes sense.
yeah, but how do you do that disclosure? Where do you do that?
Well, you can do it in public remark, in private remarks in MLS. Or you can frankly send an email to the buyer's agent, say, here's what's going on here.
Okay.
Some kind of a warning, some kind of documentation, saying here's the deal.
Okay.
And I think you've done all you can do.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Okay, in the contract, paragraph 2D, which creates a right for the seller to take something, but maybe not an obligation. That's the exclusions in the contract in paragraph 2D. Our challenge with phrases like rose bushes, chandelier, refrigerator, storage in the backyard, you need to be more specific. Big lawsuit down in Houston a few years ago. Beautiful property and backyard, like 40 rose bushes. It was a big thing for the property. And the seller took them all. And that was big, it ended up a big lawsuit. So you need to be specific. And if you got things like refrigerator, maybe you got a house, several refrigerators. If the seller's going to exclude, which one are they going to exclude? Which chandelier are we talking about? Maybe there's more than one storage shed. Just need to be clear and specific so the buyer knows what they're agreeing to. We want to do everything we can so we don't want to mitigate any possible potential for dispute. Paragraph 5, we have this happen a lot. Name of a title company. Or even worse, just the name of the person at the title company. Like everybody would know who that is. You know, and maybe somebody in this area does, but so the name of the title company, not the name of the person at the title company, just the name of the title company. and their address, because most of your larger title companies have multiple locations. So we want to make sure that we've got the right address there, because we need to know where this is going to close. We need to know, buyer's agent needs to know where we're going to take the earnest money in the auction. Our location. Because for example, if you just put down such and such title company, it kind of defaults to their headquarters. That might be. So you want to make sure that you're very clear and specific on that as you work through it. Make sure that you really got that. In paragraph 6D, the objections paragraph, you got a big blank there, which brings a right for the buyer to object, has no obligation on the seller side at all. The buyer says, well, I want to make sure I can use this as an investment property and I use it as a rental. So, whatever, your job, buyer, do the research, find if you can or not. Seller is not, when the seller sells this house to that buyer, the seller is not representing what they can do. It's only the buyer's right of objection. And needs to be as clear and specific as he can and make sure he does that. Whatever he wants to do with it. You know how I feel about residential use. I think it's a terrible phrase. Unless it's really a question, because there are a number of properties out there that are in mixed use areas, commercial and residential. And if you want to make sure that I can use this as a residential in this area, that's also a lot of commercial, you may want to put that in there. And now it's the buyer's, job to do the research and make sure that they can in fact do it. The challenge of the pool in the backyard is you need to be pretty specific. It may be that you could put a pool in the backyard, but the buyer has in mind a huge pool in the backyard, big pool in the backyard. So the more specific they can be, the more it creates that right of objection, because when you're putting something in the big blank, the buyer is creating a right of objection they otherwise may not have. Because the big thing that gets in the way, like rules, are easements. And the buyer doesn't have a right to object to easements unless they put something in the big blank. And please put a number of days in the small blank. It's probably easily quarter to a third of the transactions I see that don't have a number of days. And so put a number of days in it, put something in there, put a number, don't put a zero. Put a number of days in.
And to be clear, even if you don't have anything in the objections paragraph.
Yeah, whether you have something in the big paragraph or big blank or not, always put a number of days. Or you have something in the big blank or not. There is, I was wondering when you were going to be here, we kept saying, where is Tommy? Because we had a couple of questions. And we said, once Tommy gets here, we can talk about it. How you doing, sir?
I'm well, eating up my lunch.
What are we having?
Fried catfish.
We were good with fried. We went downhill fast with the catfish thing. Overall. Investment use, operating home business, erected, all those are things buyers got to check out and see if they can do those or not do those. Paragraph 7D2, repairs and treatments. Their corporate lawyer committee has proposed some changes that went to the commission yesterday. It'll go and be on the website for comments to be able to be approved at Trex November meeting. And one of the things that they address in paragraph 7 in dealing with, we know that if we ask for repair amendment, so may be required to do those, but they're not required to provide any receipts or anything. Well, they're looking at adding a language in paragraph 17 that actually says, yeah, you gotta give us receipts, you gotta have pay invoices, things like that. So they recognize it's enough of a problem where in the beginning of they are beginning to address it. Replace broken windows. We had this transaction. And unfortunately, we had the buyer. And we used the phrase replace broken windows. Don't know what that means. I thought they knew what it meant. So I said, well, any window where, literally the window is broken, we got to repair it or replace it. And what the buyer thought was, there's some windows where it's kind of fogged over. If the window seal is broken, so we need that to be repaired. And in fact, we want it replaced. Got replaced. And we went from a few things to a lot of things and a much, much larger expense. We ended up with a real dispute between the buyer and the seller. Of course, any dispute between the buyer and seller is going to always include us. So you want to be really, if you're gonna have replaced broken windows, what do you really mean by that? And you just mean the glass? Do you mean the whole thing? And which ones are we talking about? We're talking about the 3 in the master bedroom. We're talking about the 2 over here. Which ones are we actually talking about? Did you have a comment on that? So Jenny and Joe back here visiting. on that. Did you have a comment on this?
But you just want to let you know what a great job.
Oh, good segue. Okay. we'll work. We need to do that. And repair foundation. What's the big problem with that phrase? That was a phrase that we saw in an amendment, a repair amendment, paragraph 2, require seller to repair foundation.
Needs to be specific.
What the heck does it mean? Repair foundation based on structural engineer report, foundation company report, what are we talking about here? And is it a blank check that we're looking for? Be really clear and specific what we're talking about. Otherwise, you've got a real challenge. So you've got to be very clear and specific. on what we're talking about. It's just like in dealing with, challenges, for example, termites. Termite tree, what kind of termite tree? Partial, full, whatever. Tommy?
I got one in last night and another request to replace the plumbing system.
Plumbing system. Well, that's pretty clear. That's, do you want a new house too?
Yeah, like, what do you mean by
So you got the seller
Yeah,
and the buyer said, want to replace the plumbing system?
Yeah.
Do it now. So one of the first things is, how do we define a plumbing system?
Yeah,
Is that everything? What do you think the buyer actually wants? And there's some specific things they've come up with.
I did go back and I said, what do you call it? So you want all the plumbing system? Well, there's several ways, and I think there's some stuff in the attic we would do. Let's start in the attic. I don't see the report. Yeah, we're having a lot of fun with this.
And you do remember my thing, it was so classic, I just still love it. West Texas, we do things different with, we talk different with, all that. And so my broker friend in comment said, yeah, it's new one. And he had a seller and his friend, his broker in another company, sent a repair amendment over, and paragraph 2 said, buyer says seller fix all broke stuff. Concept, it was not broke, we're not gonna fix it, so what's the problem here? Like to be a little more specific, and then my friend, who was his agent, had seller. So, I know what Errol meant, I understood what he meant, but I said, let's get a little clearer here about what you want the seller really to do. Yeah, gotta fix all that broke stuff. Why would you fix something that's not broke? You wouldn't. So fix it all, okay? One of the little things of that, by the way, is 5X hammer, great thing. How do we even define what's broke? Who gets to define what's broke? We're in a challenging transaction where we had buyer, it's out of Rockwall, and the seller got really mad at the buyer's agent because the buyer's agent and the inspection said that the oven, the double oven, didn't work. And the inspector in the comments, what happened is that the lower part of the double oven wouldn't hold the temperature. And the seller sure said, it works, turn it on, it heats up. It doesn't hold temperature, right? So but then what we mean by it works or it doesn't work. And he was really unhappy the fact that they said his oven didn't work. Paragraph 11 on the next page here. Trek has and they talked about yesterday, and I'm still waiting to get information from Vanessa Burgess, the general counsel of Trek, about what they've come up with. Trek created a unauthorized practice of law working group. It's such an issue for Trek. They've created a whole working group to address it, to deal with it. They've had several meetings and they're preparing a report on all things they found. As you might suspect, there are 2 places that this shows up a lot. In addition to just things we insert in the paragraphs in the contract, 2 are paragraph 11, the other in the contract, and the other is paragraph 9 of the Trek amendment. where people are putting things in there that they just can't do. One of the things that Trek is beginning to have a tighter line, making the distinction between a business detail and something that affects the rights of parties. If it affects the legal rights of parties, it has to be done by an attorney. It can be done by the principals in Texas, but we advise against it. We always have to tell our client, you seek legal advice, or you do this, because I don't even know what you've done. You work through this. A little phrase on one here, home guard must purchase home. You know, we don't need to put the name of the warranty company in the contract. The only exception is if the buyer is assuming a policy that's already been paid for the year. And buyer says, yeah, that's what we use. We want you to go ahead and pay for another, if I get a full year plus the other half of this year or whatever, then you could address that in paragraph 11. That probably would be a business detail. Even when we're putting a business detail in here, we need a written instruction by our client saying, yeah, this is what we want you to say. And here's the language. We cannot create it on our own. This will just become a bigger and bigger case for Trek. And they're doing this in a positive manner, or at least from their perspective. And you do understand that I have a certain bias, and I'm a fan of how Trek is getting to do things better and better and really good. But they are really getting aggressive about encouraging complaints. They've got it on their website. Every time they go out and talk to people, they say, you know, you got a problem. Here's the process, file a complaint. We'll do, you know. So one of the things they're going down the direction of is, you know, unauthorized practice of law. And they're really pushing on things that agents are doing in the transaction that you can't be doing. I know the one about naming the warranty company, property must appraise. We had a buyer. And that was the language that the buyer wanted to put in paragraph 11. What the heck does that even mean? So I'll say, oh, yep, it looks good, it's looking good. I say, I appraise it, it's good. Yeah, the buyer in their mind, what they're saying to the seller is, we want an appraisal done, and we want the appraisal to at least meet the sales price of the property. That's what they were thinking they were asking for. That's not what they said. And what you actually say really means something. And if you heard me say it, you heard me say it a zillion times. Professionally clean the house, terrible phrase. The better phrase is, you know, we will major us to do it. Half the cost of $400. The buyer needs to identify who's going to clean the house. Let the seller cap the cost. That way the buyer can't fuss the seller because buyers own people do it. I get this on a regular basis where the seller is just working themselves to the bone, cleaning the house is perfect, it's looking great, and the buyer's built. People even live in a place like this. So professional cleaning the house, don't know what it means. It's certainly a terrible phrase. What do we find? Have another question on my Zoomers?
No, I'm writing down all their names, so they're recorded.
Oh, okay. So we know who to send the questions to later. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I just give you an example of having basically cap it. Seller delivered buyer possession property no later than 5 p.m. on the day of closing and funding. I think that's a good business detail, and I think it's a good thing. Because we do have a challenge with, you know, buyers are ready to move in. We've had closing that money, and buyers get the keys, they're ready to move in. Seller said, no, I got all day. So setting up an actual time frame, both here, and if you're going to have a temporary residential lease, also in the lease. Having both those. So I think it's not a bad thing at all.
Student buying that closing and
Pardon me?
closing and funding the same day.
I should say again.
Closing and funding isn't necessarily the same day.
No, it's not. That's why we use both of them. That's why we say both. It's not just closing, it's closing and funding.
Day versus not being later, but both have.
Or later than, I mean, so later than 5 p.m. on the day of closing and funding. There'll only be one day that you have both those happen. It doesn't have to be the same day. You could have, you know, closing on Friday and funding on Monday. I still think the day's right. What would you rather see?
Well, after both. We make it very clear to everybody. Because it's not.
It was clear to me already.
Funded rates.
Yeah, yeah, could be on the same, could be different times on the same day. But it was clear the concept of closing and funding. They both have to happen. In order for us to deal with this. So you like the fact of saying, on the day that both closing and funding happen.
No, I actually don't like either, because I like the fact the contract already says that once stuff is except for current, it's yours.
Contract already says what?
Contract already says once stuff is current, it's, you're supposed to have possession. So it's like.
That's the only choice you make in paragraph 10. Right?
Bob,
Correct. Yes.
I have a question about that.
Okay, I got a Zoomer.
Sally.
Yes, ma'am. Does she get two in one day?
She
There's
got
two
to.
in one day.
Okay, you get two.
So I understand using this in the lease. I think that's extremely important in the temporary lease. But what happens if you put that the seller shall deliver to possession no later than 5 p.m. on the day of closing and funding, and it doesn't fund until like 6 or well, it's actually doesn't fund because you've missed the funding cutoff or something.
Right.
And you can't give them the property if it hasn't funded.
Well, we're clear, if funding doesn't happen, possession doesn't transfer.
Okay. Okay,
And
that's.
that's why it's so important for us, if we've got a closing date on a Friday, warn everybody, warn them all the way from transferring utilities to planning to use that weekend to move in. Say, you know what, we need to start about 6 o'clock this morning trying to close. So we get done soon enough that we can have this all done the same day. Because, I mean, we've had huge challenges with it, and the buyers have got all their family, got everybody coming in to help move that weekend, and now they don't get it. There are ways, by the way, to resolve that. One in particular that we did is, and we had the buyer in that case, and the property was vacant. Seller already had moved out, and we had this problem. And what we were able to do is get the seller to agree to a buyer's temporary residential lease. So the buyer is able to go ahead and take possession, because all the paperwork had been done. All we're doing is wait. Now, there's still a risk. There's a risk in seller, but we had the buyer. So that way, at least the buyer can move in, get their possession, get going under this temporary residence lease. There are ways to address it. And then seller agrees to move storage shed backyard no later than 3 days prior to closing. One, it's good if you're gonna have something like that done, have it done before closing. Because what happens is the sellers all of a sudden discover how big a deal it is to move that storage shed. They decide to leave it for the buyer.
It's suddenly a lot of stuff for buyers.
We hope you'll have a, really the same luck with this storage shed as we've had. Really good. But some good parties in storage sheds. Listing agent related to buyer's agent. Listing agent does not like buyer's agent. We got a transaction. I mean, this is taking place. This is just our buyer's agent. That is nice husband and wife couple. Our buyer's agent was having an affair, it was a she, our buyer's agent was having an affair with the husband's seller.
Oh.
That's juicy.
It gets worse. A listing agent, he was having an affair with our wife. I'm sitting there working through, okay, where do we disclose everything? We'll put that paragraph 8, except paragraph 11 situations, I should work through it. It was, I mean, it really was, shades of paper, it just was one of those. Now, the buyer's agent who is no longer with us for a number of reasons. Evidently, it turns out that this was kind of her modus operandi. She tended to get a lot of business because she had a lot of relationships.
Farming tactic, I guess.
But there's some situations where, Trek has a requirement for disclosure that they make use of the line of consanguinity. Immediate family, siblings, husbands, siblings, parents, grandparents. Our policy, if you don't know it, is any relationship at all, period, any relationship on any level. What we found over tons of transactions, a transaction never doesn't happen because we've disclosed a relationship. We've never had someone who say, oh, whoa, that's your second cousin's third wife from Alabama. I'm not doing this. Never has happened. But what has happened, and I've got one right now in Rockwell, for the guys threatening and yelling and screaming, and what'd you say about Rockwell? And but it's one of those situations. Our agent, the buyer in the contract, the buyer is in the contract, is going to be on the deed, who's buying the property, is her fiance. And she disclosed in the contract that the agent is related to the buyer. And the seller discovered later that the relationship is, that's your fiance, so you're kind of more a buyer than you are an agent, aren't you? And it's created a problem. I think we'll eventually have a track as a result of it. Maybe the seller is really unhappy, even though at one point in the contract, as we were going through the transaction, the agent and her fiance were at the house doing some things, and the seller was there. And they had that conversation. The seller knew at that time the relationship and didn't say or didn't do anything. It's just that the deal went away because the seller wasn't willing to do all the repairs and all the things requested by the buyers. I think the agent is really influencing the buyer because she's going to live in the house. She really wants it the way she wants it, kind of thing. However, even with that experience, I don't think I would say to agents, if you represent a fiance or something like that, now clearly if there's a marriage or whatever, but just because that's your fiance or your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or whatever, I don't have to disclose that. Now you got to make a judgment call there because we've had that unfortunate experience. Saying, well, you need to know that as an agent that that's my boyfriend buying a house. Why do we care about that? Maybe it's not gonna be your boyfriend next week. I don't know. But you really do have to go through disclosures to remove from the other side. They're gonna fuss at you later. When things go south and they're looking for excuses or for problems, if there was not a disclosure, they're gonna use that against you. So you need to always make sure that you do that and work through. Paragraph 2 of the amendment, the repair request, stop trying to scrunch everything in paragraph 2. Just, can't even read it. Paper sheet, refer to attached repair request list. And you should go ahead and not only have it over, attached repair request list, have signature box. Everybody signed off on what's attached to number 2. Several repair items so noted on the attached correct inspection report. This is a couple of issues here. One, do we want to give up the inspection report? That's a buyer decision, whether they want to give it up or not. Some buyers will say, yeah, that way if they don't work with us, they've got to disclose it, so that gives us a little leverage to work through it. Some buyers say, well, I had to pay for the inspection report. If they wanted, then they ought to pay some of the costs, split it with us or something. But referencing to repair items on the inspection report, the way the inspector makes note of defects and so forth, doesn't tell the buyer is not telling the seller, here's what we want you to do. Because the way the inspector is written, it doesn't do that. So the buyer needs to be very clear and specific. They can reference to a part of the inspection report. In fact, they could send that one page over saying, here's the problem we've got. Here are the windows in the master bedroom that are broken, and here's what the inspector says about it. And those are the ones we specifically want to have repaired. So you be very clear. Hello, Mr. Brody. Welcome to the class. Thank you. This has been a great day. We've had Tommy. Now we've got you. Tommy had some really good. No, you actually. Are you stuck on anything? I could use your help. We were talking about the new stuff at Craig coming down with, which you may or may not know, in addition to all the other things that we've done in the past, Mike is a former chair of the Texas Real Estate Commission. So he was the head person there. And that is an incredible, the amount of work that the chair has to do, the stuff that he's done, people don't understand it. It's a huge load. I'm watching Scott Kestner, who's doing a great job right now.
It's good now.
He's got no life. I mean, that's his whole thing here. Now you were at NAR recently. Anything new coming down that we ought to be concerned with? And how are we doing on any of our suits or any of our situations where everybody thinks we're
For a subcommittee.
okay? Okay. That's good. Well, thank you for coming in. A great group here, and we got Zoomers.
I do,
Yeah, so we're doing good, and we're having some.
Draws a crowd.
We have some good comments and some good questions here, and they've stayed awake almost the entire time. It's been really, I don't mind dozing off as long as there's no snoring, because it's really disruptive. So we got to work through that. So we understand what the inspector says in the inspection report doesn't help. I mean, the buyer's got to be very clear and specific. Air conditioning heating to be evaluated. What's your point? Going to be evaluated? What then? Air conditioning and heating to be evaluated, repairs needed. Who gets to make the decision? Is that the air conditioning company? Who's the air conditioning company? Is there any, cap on the cost? What's really going on there? Need to be very clear and specific as you work through. On page 5 there, seller agrees to treat for termites. There are a lot of different termite treatments, whole house treatments, spot treatments. What is the buyer really wanting there? We already talked about the roof issue. To evaluate whether we rely on the roofer to make that decision. I don't think so. Is the seller going to say, yeah, I agree to this? Let your roofer, your Uncle Charlie, go out there and cut a deal, and it's gotta be just. Paragraph 9 of the amendment, same challenges. Paragraph 9 of the Trek Promulgated Amendment is just like paragraph 11 of the contracts. It's where we deal with issues, whatever. For example, seller and buyer agree to reduce the sales price. It's not paragraph 9, it's paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 is where we have the sales price. We have the loan amount, have the down payment, we have the sales price. One of the things that in that hour-long conversation I had with that Trek investigator, one thing she said that Trek doesn't like is redundancy. One, don't put things in the wrong place. Don't be redundant. Don't you filled out paragraph 1 correctly, good. And then you went down to paragraph 9 and said, oh, by the way, what we're doing in paragraph 9 is we're reducing sales price. Thank you very much. It's really nice you tell us that. So you kind of work through the other. So make sure you're doing it correctly and work through that. Seller agrees to increase seller contribution in lieu of all repairs. Well, that's item 4 on the amendment. If you're going to increase seller contribution, that's paragraph 12A1B. That's item 4 on the amendment that specifically addresses 12A1B. So if you're going to change that amount, you do that there. Now, I do understand the concept. Occasionally a seller will say, I just need to be clear. The reason I'm agreeing to do this is I'm not going to do any repairs. Well, explain to the seller, well, you're not required to do any repairs you haven't agreed to anyway. That's terms of the contract. Yeah, I know, but I just wanted to be extra clear that I'm going to increase, the seller contribution. And the reason I want to do this is I'm not doing any repairs. So in lieu of all repairs, I'm doing. Well, I understand seller being extra cautious, fine. They decide they're going to do that. And they can put that in paragraph 9 of the amendment. We want to do that. And you say, okay, make sure you get a legal advice on doing this, but they could do that. Yes, question.
Statement
Yeah.
or anything. So I have always found that lenders don't ever want to see that statement of in
Yeah.
lieu of repair.
They don't see anything about repairs. Oh, repairs? No, don't know about it. Certainly don't let our underwriters find out. You're repairing the property. No, it's terrible. You're right. And so this really does become a lender conversation when the buyer begins to say what they're going to put in there. You talk to the lender, say, hey, what do you have heartburn seeing? As you work through that. So you want to make sure as you work through that process that and then seller buyer agree to change the date of sale of the property addendum. This is an important date for a buyer and seller to be aware of. It's a kill date. And so that date in the sale of the property addendum if on that date, if the buyer hasn't satisfied or waived the contingency, the contract automatically terminates. And sometimes, but most of the time, that date is the date of closing in the contract. So when that date gets moved around a little bit, then they probably need to move that date, that kill date in the addendum. What they do is, they're very clear and specific. Buyer and seller agree to change the date in paragraph A of the seller of the property. Addendum from to, you put a new date and attach that addendum to the amendment. Because it'd be signed off of, actually, you got that change, you got that done. Don't just say, oh yeah, we're gonna change it as you know. Just be a little clearer. But it's really, it's valuable for them to understand that date. And they move that and change it away. So that's a good thing to do. They also, if you want to change the backup contract date, same thing, it's fill date. Communication during the transaction. There's a class. It's reading the mind of your client 101. Remember, I took that as you were getting your license, that you took that. Because we're required to read the mind of our clients. We're making all these decisions, going through this process. We in fact need to know what they think. I mean, even though we know our client is the decision maker, we make decisions for them all the time. Because we provide them information that we feel is relevant for them making a decision. You can't tell them everything because they won't spend time listening to it. So you tell them what's relevant, which means you've just made a decision on what's not relevant. So you read their mind about what's important, what's not important. It's like when you choose what to show them. And I really like Lance Taylor as he went through that process. He showed the buyer and worked with the buyers. They set things up. So he gets to the, let's have those three must-haves. So as we're looking at properties, we're pulling properties up. We're not going to pull up 100 properties out there. You know, we're going to pull up a much lower number, but it's going to be the ones that meet your must-haves. So I think being really, really clear. You've got to be able to read their mind. We make judgment calls on our clients, and I don't want to be disrespectful. You really need to make a judgment call on whether or not your client is a little crazy.
They're out there in droves.
Because, you know, and that can have a very broad meaning. One, you always look at how they make decisions, and you're going to provide information to them based on how they make decisions. Some of them need really good detailed information. Some of them listen to every word you say and put meaning on every word you say, meaning that you didn't mean. You say, I had no intention for that. Just like you might say some things to and they think, what, you're telling me I'm in default and you're saying, I'm going to get sued? I mean, they'll read things into what you say and how you say those things. Remember, we did a whole class on conversations. What you say and how you say it, who you say it to is really key. So as we're going through that process, and really making sure that they hear what we say. On one level, it seems disrespectful, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Next question. Is this Sally again?
I'm sorry, I thought I was on mute. No
I'm gonna give
question.
you a hard time about your third thing here. I'm not sure you get three in one day.
I'm sorry.
But maybe for you, Sally, we would do that.
Okay.
So as we work through, you do need to pay attention to your communication with your client different times of the day. If it's late at night and they've been drinking, I'm serious.
With the client. That's
You knew not to do it. You knew not to talk to them after 10 o'clock at night. They were drinking.
Like 6 o'clock, I was like, I know.
Yeah, they do it. See, you need to recognize that. You need to limit what you're doing.
I think the longer you've been in this business, you start to become aware of what you say matters.
Oh,
You have
yeah.
to be very deliberate with some, and most of my clients are professionals and they want just facts and they're.
Yeah, but they're going to interpret what they think the facts mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And we've got to have a good sense of how much they attack. Because remember, we're clear. Not everybody hears what you say. But the other side of that, they hear more than what you said.
Yeah.
They read things into it as you work through it. And you've got to have a sense of that. That's why you want to reconfirm every one of those conversations in email. Make sure on the same page about what we think we've just talked about, what we think we've just agreed. So certain times of the day,
What did you hear me say?
yeah, exactly. Well, you tell them, here's what I think we've just talked about. Here's what I think I've said. Is this what you think I've said? Is this, because you'll have in every one of your conversations, you'll have the next step. You'll end with, and here's our next conversation. This is what it's going to be, and this is what it's going to be about. You go through that step every single time, and your email will confirm that's what we're going to be doing as you kind of work through that. So you'll always do that. Which means as you go through that, you're reading their mind. And I make a little thing about, certain times of the day. And it's not just, it's medication issues. Because, they're, without, I mean, you can't say to a potential prospect, say, okay, so let's talk about all the medications you're taking and how that affects you and when you take them and when should we not talk and when should. Because one of the hard realities, if you go out on a listing presentation and there are 3 sheets to the wind, they can't sign that agreement. They're under the influence, not being an enforceable agreement. Just wasted your time. So we've got to be aware of the impact. Do you have to explain to them 3 sheets to the wind? Joe asked about that. Okay.
No one's got these versions.
So, we've got to look for those things because they'll say things and they'll do things and you go, where's that coming from? And it's because you called them at the wrong time of day, or you talked to them the wrong time of day, or you said something that just set them off. And you go, wow, yeah. And maybe you'd never said that before. And all of a sudden you realize they have attached a meaning to something that you weren't aware of. Because you hadn't been in your set of experiences, but it was in their set of experiences. And you recognize that, you work through it. Everybody has a different world that they live in, that they got to where they are. You work through it. Clarify that if it's not in the contract, the other party does not have to do it, which means if the party does not agree in writing to do something, then they may not, because they do not have to do the other thing. It drives me nuts when buyers and sellers get together and talk to each other and agree to do things and think it means something. Well, it's good for them to get to know each other and work through things and kind of get solve problems, but they need to understand none of it is an obligation. But until it gets added to the contract in an amendment or in some way, shape, or form, they don't have to do it. And yet one of the parties is absolutely relying on that being done. When it doesn't get done, it just blows the whole deal. So we need to make sure that they understand, here's the concept of what we're doing. So if it's not in the contract, it just doesn't exist. It works to do that. The personal item things, the obligation to clean the house, no requirement for that. I mean, it depends a little bit on what's going on, at the time of the contract, if you're obligated to do that. 9 closings. 3 of them right now, 2 here and 1 in Rock. And that's over the last 2 weeks. Happens on a regular basis. Question? Is it raining? Breeze, take a picture. Don't need rain. Yeah.
Let's go with work.
Here's our challenge. Here's our challenge. We've got a closing and doesn't happen. We need to understand what that means in the transaction. The closing date, paragraph 9 of the contract, or in paragraph 3 of an amendment, establishes dates that the parties need to perform that final act. Unless there's temporary residential lease and there's further acts to follow. If either party or both parties decide when this date hits, that you're not going to do it. More common thing is buyers deciding not to buy. Maybe it's financing, maybe one thing or the other, And that's the one that happens more, but it's not huge. It's more like 60-40, 70-30, 60 buyers, 40 sellers. It's harder for a seller to get away with than for a buyer. As you work through that, because the buyer can always compensate the seller, say, you know, here's the air. You get to keep there, you get to have the air. It wasn't your money, so I'm my money, so I'm giving you that $5,000, so let us go. Let's move on. So when you've got a buyer here and seller here, what you need to know is the instant you find out it's not going to close, you look at who decides it's not going to close. Is it your client or the one on the other side? So if it's the buyer who's saying, not going to close, are they making use of some right of termination in the contract to not close? This is where your knowledge of the contract and the addendums come into play. Because if the reason they're not going to close is it's on the kill date of the sale of the property addendum, and they haven't sold their other house and are not willing to waive the contingency, then they have that right to not close. Actually, it's an automatic non-closing. It's automatic kill date. So you got to look, do they still have a right to terminate based on the HOA, based on seller disclosure notice, based on some performance requirement? So the first thing is when your buyer says, you know what, I'm not going to close. Okay. You know, you would nicely, black buck, bang, got a Mercedes payment coming in. I need that money. But you are going to say, okay, why? Let's talk about it. Because, you know, in your conversation, you're going to seek legal advice conversation, have that. But you're going to kind of want to know what their situation is. Maybe a totally legitimate, good situation. I think it was you had to sell it.
I did.
I had a bunch of them, but I mean, this is one I'm thinking about is his. So the seller got some bad news from his doctor. And it fatal, he rather moved off, he's going to stay here with friends and family. And so we had a legitimate reason why he's not going to sell. Unfortunately, the buyer in that case said, no, I'm going to buy it. We got a contract. And remember Jerry Prager wrote a letter for the buyer. She got an attorney involved, wrote a letter for the buyer, and we had to work it out. And fortunately, the seller had money and he paid off the buyers, I recall.
Yes, that's exactly where my husband's dying. What do I care about this money?
Yeah, what's the point here? Yeah, sure. And so, sometimes there are heart-wrenching reasons why a buyer won't close or seller won't close. So you need to have that conversation because it helps you. You're always going to be respectful because you're a professional. Sometimes you need to be extra professional, extra respectful because there's something going on that's just heart-wrenching. We've all had some of that. We've all had it where we just discovered the reason that they're not going to, one of their children just died. I mean, something just heart-wrenching. So you need that as ammunition for you to work through and to deal with. So you're going to find out what's going on. You're going to look at that. When you're right in there, what is it the seller's rights are? If the buyer doesn't close, buyer terminates, what can the seller do? Now, all of this is going to come around a couple of things that you have to be really, really careful of. Don't give any legal opinions. And saying, well, if you don't close, you're in default. That's a legal opinion. Even though default is paragraph 15 of the contract and states if you don't do this, then it's got some what looks like some pretty easy, clear language. What's been ruled over and over again is that if we as license holders say to a client, you're in default, you just practice law. So what you can say is, here's what's on the contract. Now, at that point in time, you're going to send them paragraph 15. And second, you're going to say, you need to seek legal advice to know what your rights and responsibilities are. Yes.
I had a seller who into the closing dates didn't even close. And she found out, and I had the selling side, that there was a $90,000 lien, mechanics lien on her house. She says, I'm not closing. I'm gonna fight this, I'm not closing. The buyers performed anyway. They performed.
What they should do.
Which they should do, right? I had to be very careful not to say, well, you're in default. I said, you need to seek legal counsel.
Exactly. That's
Find
all
out
you can
what
say.
happened.
And that's all you can say.
It's all you
You're
can say.
exactly right.
And we did close it. We closed it.
Good. So they got that resolved. Because there are ways for a good attorney to get that resolved, and they get it resolved in a timely manner.
And she kept saying, what should I do? What should I do? It's like, you gotta learn, you know?
Big A. Attorney time. That, I mean, literally, that's what it is. They've got to understand this is a legal issue, and they've got to do that. They've got to, get some good legal advice on what to do that. And often the title company attorney will be able to help us if there's a lien that may not be an enforceable lien and should be removed, and it's a trespassing title, and they get that resolved. Maybe you'll be able to close around it. It's going to depend on the title company and exactly what all
They
of it.
reduced the lien, but she was still upset. She didn't
Okay.
close, and she closed 3 days later.
Okay, we'll see. But she did that because you got it worked out. She worked through the process. And that's good, because, that's ideally what we want. And I don't mean to be self-serving on this. We want this because frankly, we've done a lot of work. And we had closing and we expect a commission.
Exactly.
We want to get paid.
Another thing, she did not disclose it.
Did she know about it?
She knew about it. I found out she knew about it. So I was working in the dark. She knew that she had this lien on her house because she says to me after the fact, well, I knew about one lien, but I didn't know about the other. So it accumulated, it added up to like 9.
Yeah.
And I said, you didn't put that on. And I went back, oh, it was wrong. She didn't.
Wasn't there? Yeah.
So, yeah, it was pretty bad.
Well, wouldn't the title company know that?
If it's a lien in public records, they would pick it up.
That's how they found
Yeah.
out. So they do their due diligence. They said, she has a lien. And she said, oh, I knew about one. I didn't know about the other.
Yeah.
And she didn't disclose.
Because, one of the realities is that sellers don't disclose some things for several reasons. One, they honestly really don't remember. You lived in a house for 30 years. You don't remember all the times you repaired and did things. Well, you don't remember all that stuff. Sometimes you forget it. And especially, some people remember things better than other people. Sometimes they just don't remember. Other times, there's lying.
She was lying. Sorry,
No.
but she was.
And that's part of the deal. It's just part of
She
people.
paid off her sister's baby ground.
She did what?
She borrowed the money and refinanced to pay off her sister's.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah. So things get worked out. So, okay, moving on. So we understand that when this happens, we have a non-closing. If it's your client who's decided not to close, legal advice. Now, how you say that's important, because if you say it in a certain way, they'll think you're telling them that they're the ones at fault and they're the ones that are going to get sued. And so you need to say, you know what? And have a nice little neutral statement. Says, anytime someone chooses not to perform according to the terms of a contract, they should seek legal counsel. We're not saying you're in default. We're not saying it's a breach, but anytime someone chooses, and they need to understand it's a choice, chooses not to perform to the terms of a contract, they need to seek legal counsel on their rights and responsibilities on the terms of contracts.
She also asked me if I would refer her to an attorney, which
Okay.
I stayed away from that.
Okay, so depending on the circumstances, we have several attorneys who would say, yeah, here's some attorneys' names, call them and see if you want to talk to them. These are attorneys that we have that relationship with and all that kind of stuff, so. So you can do that, but be careful, make a judgment call each time you do it. You do it, so if it's your client who's not performing, here's what you got to do. Now, as far as what goes on the other side, say, well, if it's a buyer, for example, what can the sellers have no idea? That's what paragraph 15 is all about. That's what attorney's advice is all about. We cannot tell you what the seller will do or can do. Can't have that conversation at all. So you totally stay away from it. I don't know. You did know that they're a member of the family. You got lots of problems. It had the transaction where there was this guy down in Florida. I have an old partner who lived down in that area. And he and his father were friends of the family. Right, you know what I'm talking about, the family. I understand the family.
The family, come on.
Oh,
Yeah. Do the Godfather, all that kind of family. So they knew it. He said, and they were talking about this real estate investor guy who was out here doing stuff down in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, down there. Where he had some big mansions down there that people are only there a few months out of the year. New Yorkers, things like that. And he'd forge documents and he'd sell us that. He'd sell those houses. Get your money and go sell another house. And he kept doing it. And FBI was after him and all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, he wasn't doing it anymore. And so they kind of researched back and they found the last one he did it on was owned by the family. He got taken care of. For that guy. You got to go through that process. We don't know what they're gonna do on the other side or what will happen. We got to deal with it. Most of the time, the issue with the non-closing, most of the time, certainly not all the time, but many times it comes down to the earnest money. And battle over the earnest money. And the reality is, an earnest money battle is 100% a battle between the buyer and the seller. We don't have the earnest money. We don't have any control over the earnest money. It's to the title company. The title company is very clear. Until everyone signs a release, this money's not going anywhere. And at some point in time, we'll interplead with the courts. And the legal fees will eat up all this money and nobody will get anything. So you guys ought to work something out. But the battle of the earnest money, and then you write your client says, you know what? Whatever you'd like to do, we'd be happy to present. Your job at that point in time is communication. Whatever your client wants to communicate to the other side. If the other side has sent you communication, you present that to your client, say, okay, what would you like to do? Send it back. Your job then is that conduit back and forth. They're the decision maker to work through it. You'll have buyers say, well, you know what? If you don't give my earnest money back, it's going to tie the property. You can't sell to anybody else. Well, there are good attorneys out there who say, well, yeah, we can. And here's how we do that. And there are other people who represent themselves say, you know what? Now you can't tie it up because here's how we work. So you can have leverage on both sides. You have people on both sides have good attorneys. You got good speed. You got a whole room full of attorneys over here. We'll take that case, another whole room over here. So there's no for sure. But as you go through and you deal with that battle over the earnest money and work through that. The thing about the earnest money that I like for us to kind of consider, the earnest money was actually money out of the buyer's checking account. So if the seller doesn't get the earnest money, they haven't lost it. Because it was never their money. So it's easier for the seller to say, okay, if I can get rid of the buyer who was kind of a crazy buyer, I'm glad you're not buying my house anyway, it's probably a good thing. Give them the earnest money back, let's move on. And so sometimes that'll work out if the seller kind of thinks through a little bit, says, yeah, okay, it's true. But it's one of those things that as you help your clients understand earnest money issue, first of all, here's the title company policy. And then now this is buyer seller. We're happy to, as we represent you, tell us what you want to do. We'll send you the other side back and forth and work through the process. And at some point in time, what tends to happen is they settle at some point. It worked out because once they do understand, neither one of them are going to ever get the benefit of the money. It goes, gets interpleaded. Sometimes the reason they let that happen is because out of spite. I don't know if that buyer to ever get any money out of this at all. The heck with him. I'm not signing nothing. Let it go to the courts. I don't care. And I do certainly that happens. Now, I want to go to this last page. The concept of the real estate contract. This is not just the contract. This is every agreement, listing agreement, fire rep agreement. What we're dealing with is a civil matter. We're dealing with a contract that are promises between the parties. We're trusting that everybody is going to do what they've agreed to do. This happens in the listing agreement and buyer rep agreement. You take on a listing agreement, you begin to expend time, energy, and money, you're trusting that seller's going to sell the house. Got one going right now with an agent. I don't even think she's on a Zoom call. But she's very suspicious the seller is now not gonna sell the house. He's gonna wait her out till it expires. That's several months ago, and he's, and I say, well, one, we cannot make a seller sell. We can get some point in time, says, we performed and under the terms of the agreement, you owe us a commission. And we go through that process and we send a demand, send an invoice and work through it. We will probably not sue. In all the years we've worked through this, we've actually never sued. We've always settled. We've always gone through some settlement process. And my agent is very frustrated, and I understand her frustration. He said, well, you're saying, I ain't good. What's the point? It's a civil agreement. And it all comes down to how enforceable it is. And every civil agreement, just like a purchase contract, listing agreement, buyer rep agreement, those are all civil agreements. And if the parties decide for whatever reason to not do what they've agreed to do, nothing automatically happens. It requires a party to take action against the other side. For a transaction, our agent had a transaction, had the buyer, in a contract, and the seller not only decided not to sell to our buyer, actually entered into a contract with another buyer and closed it. Our buyer went ballistic, just like, and the listing agent, the property was owned by her mother. So she knew what was going on. So our buyer was just furious and just yelling and screaming and I'm gonna sue and And what happens? Nothing. He talked to a good attorney, said, okay, here's what you could do and here's what's gonna cost you and here's what might happen and it's not worth it. I mean, aggravation, the frustration, all that. Most of the time, it's not worth the hassle to go to court, to go through the process. And because remember, there's no E&O in a plaintiff action. It's all out of your pocket. It's all out of our pocket. If you're going to include us, we've got to approve that. So it's a civil agreement. We're trusting everybody to do what they say they're going to do. And if they choose not to, things that we can do are just so minimal. And it's really between the people who are the parties to the agreement. Let's agree by a rep agreement. We're a party to the agreement, so we can make some choices there as you work through it. And what we try to do is go through the process and make the demand. And what we've done it. So whenever you take a listing, you're making the judgment call that you trust that seller. You're spending time, energy, and money. And if it doesn't work out, all of a sudden the seller turns against you, then you need to make sure that you accept the risk that you spend money that you're not ever going to get back. That's just the risk of this business. Same thing on the buyer side. You've driven that buyer all over God's kingdom and worked through the process, spent all that money on gas. And then he said, well, I'm not going to buy it. Or I'll go out to somebody else or whatever. There's a certain level of risk. Now, that doesn't mean you don't enforce your agreements. You don't try to push them and try to really make sure, but you've got to make a judgment call, how committed they are, how much you can trust that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. It's just like when you've got a buyer, you trust that in this transaction, when they make an offer, get in a contract, you trust that they continue to move forward and want to buy the house. And we trust that the people on the other side have properly represented the seller really is going to sell the house and really has the ability to sell the house. There's a lot of trust involved in this. And you're constantly getting feedback all the way through the transaction when things have changed. Because things change. I mean, your buyer's circumstances change. All of a sudden, you've got a seller who finds a lien and their situation has changed. So we get bad news from a doctor and your situation has changed. We understand that real estate happens in the middle of life. Lots of things happen. We've got to be prepared for the risk that we're taking. We're going through that process. And it's incredibly hard as you work through it. The big promise the seller is making, he's going to sell the house. Actually, the big promise the seller is making is he has the authority to sell the house. We're really getting that promise from the listing agent. They've done their job and made sure that the seller really does own the property, has to be able to sell. Now, I used to not talk about that part a lot, except it keeps happening. Because it keeps happening, I said, well, we kind of need to be aware of that. It happens in trust situations. It happens in executor situations, estate situations. It happens in people who think they own a property, and in fact, they own it under a contract of deed. We got two of them right now, one here and one in Rockwall, where they don't really own the property. They have equitable interest under a contract for deed. Their ability to transfer title is subject to their ability to acquire title under the terms of the contract for deed. And it cannot go on MLS because they don't have to be simple title. You cannot represent to a buyer that this is the actual owner of the property, who has to be simple title if you sell it. So it creates a little bit of a challenge. To answer your question.
Saying, didn't they know that? Because they already pulled the tax roll. But are you Bob? Because you kind of look like Susie, like, you know.
Well, here's the challenge. Until fairly recently, actually the legislative session previous to this, where they now require contract for deeds to be recorded in public records, nobody knew about it. Contract for deeds weren't recorded and we didn't even know. How even did their search, they just found out here's the person who owned it. Worked through the process and discovered fairly late. It already had the property on the market, started in there going through the process. So we need to make sure that the person who is in contract to sell the property really does have that authority. Nick's giving me that look like, I don't know about it.
I'm just trying to roll through the scenario in my head where that would happen.
Or what would happen.
Like these two scenarios that you have somebody, how did they not realize that all they have is a contract to deed or?
No, they knew they had under contract for deed, but they thought they still had total ownership and total control and had the right to sell the property. The right to sell the property is under the terms of the contract for deed. And the problem is there is no standard contract for deed document. We can't look at it and say, oh yeah, you got all kinds of rights here, not a problem, you get to do it. Takes an attorney. As you work through, so they knew they weren't the fee simple owner, although when we were reading throughout the phrase fee simple owner, oh, no, we owe money on this. That's not what I meant, by fee simple title, it was pretty clear. Work through and make sure you deal with that. So it could be a little bit of a challenge. So we need, we're trusting that the listing agent have done their due diligence. This really is the seller of the property, the owner of the property. Just like the listing agent and the seller are trusting the buyer's agent, have done their due diligence on the buyer. And this buyer really does have the ability to purchase the property under the terms of their offer as you work through that process. It's kind of a little bit of a challenge as you kind of work through it. The purchase contract and real estate contract that we deal with in Texas, they call it an earnest money contract. Even though, as we're clear, earnest money does not have to be a part of the contract, parties don't have to have it. As you kind of work through and deal with that. The promise of the seller to sell him, promise the buyer to buy, that exchange of promises is in fact the consideration for the contract, because you have to have consideration as you work through that. As we go through this, we've got to make those judgment calls all the way through the process. Now, having said all that, I find that some of our best agents are really good at when these glitches happen, being able to work through the details of it and getting worked out. And a good agent can get through that and get it done. Now, it won't happen every time, because sometimes you can't overcome all the obstacles that people throw up. Because sometimes they really are crazy. Or they're just bad people. I mean, there are people out there that are just bad people. They like the concept of taking advantage of agents and using the agents, gases and working with all that. But the big thing out of all this, it is worth the papers written on. The purchase contracts are enforceable in court. They've been enforced. Our contracts in Texas have been enforced by courts over and over again. A good solid contract. But the process of getting to court is horrendous, incredibly expensive. The reality is it can be more than the cost of the property itself. You just find yourself, it's just not worth it. And the big thing is the aggravation. My biggest challenge, I have a bad attitude about lawsuits because we got to, we pay for, every year. We pay for a good amount for it, although not as much as some other of my friends. We've got a good record here. And the reality, as we kind of work through all of that and deal with it, lawsuits is just money. We got to, our deductible is $5,000. Your part is 70%. So worst case scenario is $3,500. The real cost to you is the interruption in your business and the emotional aspect. Because I don't care whether you did anything right or wrong or whatever, it's just the emotional aspect of being sued. And please don't, well, you'll have to read all of the lawsuits, you'll have to read the plaintiff's thing. Don't take it seriously. Because they teach them in law school how to just say as many bad things as you can possibly say about somebody, hope some of it sticks. And they'll say things about you that are just, I mean, you go, whoa. I'm not a bad person like that. I mean, they really are. There's no limit on what they can say about you. You know, there are a few discriminatory violations, but aside from those, make sure you know you want, and they will. They'll just say things you. I never drown. And you just don't take any of it seriously. You take it through a book. And attorneys know exactly how to address it, deal with it, respond to it. That's it. We have never, ever, in all my years of doing this, where we had a lawsuit and went to an E&O, we have never been in court. And I don't anticipate we ever will, because the E&O will always stop. It's always less expensive to settle than to go to court. Because the court costs, we finally get to court, probably is 4 or 5 times the settlement. Not more. So we'll never end up, we'll always settle at some point, which is really a problem, because you said these people don't deserve anything and they're walking away with money. It's just wrong. And so my final good example, we had the seller and bad buyers sued our seller. And as it turns out, our seller did screw up. And we finally got it resolved the day before the lawsuit, the day before court. And this was our third mediation attempt. Because our seller finally admitted, well, okay, now maybe I didn't disclose something. Well, it cost our seller $400,000. Our seller wrote a check for $400,000. And our seller was, I know I screwed up, I understand that, but I'm really aggravated that these buyers can't say anything, because these are really bad buyers. But justice sometimes prevails. The buyers had an attorney who is a really, really good attorney. He's fearless. He sues judges. And what he's really, really good at is racking up legal. In one of our depositions, he was there with 2 other of his attorneys. They were videoing it. I mean, the amount of cost for an all-day deposition, his count was his legal fees to these buyers were $750,000. And they couldn't pay it. So he sued them. So these buyers didn't get dime one. In fact, they didn't sue by their own attorneys. Sometimes justice works. Guys, thank you very much for being here. Good job. Hey.
She's a list. Christine.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so she has a listing. Her seller. Yesterday. Ambulance. It's the fast. I feel like we should have.
Like, is it processing or?
That crack, I know, like, that never made a video fire like whatsoever, but it's really.
You work it out.
It's not that big a deal. My life was, you don't want to go back on the seller, and the seller says, well, I asked Christine, and she said it didn't happen. I told her it's probably best stuff.
So we would never see.
Yeah.
So we did see if they like, we needed out to the fire. We just asked. She asked one of our inspectors that not the one.
Didn't actually see.
He said, I want to do what I.
Okay, that's what I thought, that's fine.
People, if they don't think it's. It's like something. So, people find it. They're very scared. I do understand. But what about your?
We want to do it sooner. That's all.
No, I mean, maybe because it is sick, but I'm. They can.
Comes down to the
It
fund.
doesn't, I know the funding is part of it, but I'm also thinking of the same people who.
Oh, what about? Yeah. Talking about. What about like that?
Like, which we don't have. I don't have my thing.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe that's what I'm like. So I want to. My.
What do you mean by investments?
I don't see.
That's what I would say. If it was on Thursday, that's Friday morning at 9 o'clock. If I did not, there was 15 Thursday. One of the investors, you asked me to make a statement about what the expectations are. Everybody's thinking they don't understand that. Yeah, I'm excited about that. I want to ask, like, I want to know. Get some little. So now they have it on. So 9 o'clock, I'm ready to work. I'm beginning there. Now that's all I did.
You know how cities are like, you haven't been, have you been in California? Okay, so you know LA, right? It's one side of the skyscrapers, the oval and everything. So what they do in Dubai is $1 trillion project, so starting it. Sort of they, then it's, they don't want to store it as much as. Building back door. What they're doing is condensing it into one line. So this whole thing is going to be like, line in line, so you're gonna get out, and then it'll look like this, everything will be super. But yeah,
Never tapping.
yeah, it's brand new and everyone's like going crazy about it. It's called the line by. Yeah, but like. What about
I don't.
I don't do.
No later than time. It's earlier.
Overcoming.
Now the seller has
Uh,
agreed to not have.
And honestly, you know, like that.
And so.
Yeah.
What you're saying.
They make it, I guess, make sure that it's one of the things. I think it's easy for people to think that you need.
You don't change it. Take away the time, right? You just wanted to take away the number of time.
The other investor.
So what you're saying is if you fund at 9 o'clock next morning, that's the point. I'll give up position.
That's what it's right now. Right now it's double D. So when it ends, whatever time that is, whatever it's down for the time. It's been same time this. My buyer.
So your example.
Closed on Thursday. I didn't get to move it on Thursday. And now I get to move it on Friday morning. Now this one gets to go. So it's sad.
I understand, but if we have just closing funding, take the timeline out, funds, 9 o'clock.
Oh, okay. That's like, it's kind of like my TV. Calabasas.
Okay, so right now, here's the rest of our counseling.
Yeah.
Right now.
Everything, Beverly Hills is a nice place, very expensive.
I know. No, I'm happening.
Yeah, that's like minimum like.
I understand, we're in possession.
Everything up there is like a million.
Paragraph 10.
And then,
You know, I'm paying proration all the way the
I
entire
have
day.
a personal life that, I've been.
I'm paying proration the entire day. So I've got till 11:59.
That's what I'm meaning, what, no, I'm gonna do this. But you did have the attorney complaints, if there's already something that is, my thing is. You take it today, it says, we don't have, it already does. You also.
What house is it all?
It's wherever it says. I have a property, they only if you own it through the whole day, it already is addressed, right? Isn't it already addressed?
Paragraph 13.
Okay, so guardian restoration operations are
See,
done.
that is, so it is, I'm not giving up possession until the end of the day. I have the entire day. Reason for the time.
But if you sign where you- They do, but it's so.
So I'm saying, doesn't mean that 9:05, I've got to give up possession. I mean, they've got the entire day. Because I'm paying for it. I said, no,
I'm holding on to
funded.
fines right now.
You know, you've got my money.
And they all.
I can move in right now. We got a battle between the buyer and seller. Concept.
I guess that's kind of like what you're saying.
You know, here's the timeline on that day we have closing. Otherwise, it's a different interpretation. Seller side.
I like you, I like you to be
What happens
next
that
thing.
day?
It's actually how it comes, somebody responsibility. I think like, if it's like that, simple more, but
We've had more problems by not having it on.
really in all the world, we don't have, and there's all the time we've ever done, and the thing we've had a multitude of contracts with people.
We've had enough problems. We felt like it was a good idea.
We haven't had more. Sorry, maybe the first one, we haven't had more, but we've had that.
Also. Juggling.
People say that the only reason, I mean, my right is, voting a lot, about rates, and people didn't know about it.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, that's really what I'm trying to do. The other thing, but a long time ago.
Yeah.
25, so that house that was, that's what we did, I said, contract, I had two buyers, people near $2 per pair, because the house. Sounds like a couple of. And 11 on the sell, because I needed to stay in so I could get their buy.
So you want to aim for.
Agent
PA,
went to
that's
terminate.
what PI. That's good.
Using the HOA. I didn't even have the HOA docs yet.
Wow.
You were so very clear with me that it didn't matter, so that you didn't have the HOA docs yet.
That's great.
Because.
Good. You know, I'm actually putting it.
Seller.
Covered in mortgage.
And I agree with that, that was my.
Possibility equity on top of that. So
I'm
the
saying you
investment
change
will also be there.
And all the attorneys have said, no, that's not it now. The other side of it is also true.
Reality is they're gonna get out. This year.
Yeah.
I understand the reality was out, but I didn't.
I disagree.
It's a definitely a good investment.
You really do. So
In this career.
I just know that I'm like,
that is a challenge. Correct.
Yeah, it sounds like we got a
Um,
lot of stuff figured out.
I think when I don't want to be all the way, when you are gonna have the HOA docs, I want to know that items go out. Did where, remember, he was sitting over there. He was like, you already have the HOA docs, the first buyer, and I thought what he said, and I didn't catch it, because I was like, I don't know. Repeat thing, give them the information, and then they have 3 days.
You know, it's the thing.
They check off number 4. They don't have it.
How-
It's a great opportunity to have emphasized that they kind of knew started to, but I thought it should be.
That's it. Consider by what's the 80s by then. I wasn't 82, so.
I think when we find out, they don't always like too big, right? And plus, some things I like to, I don't necessarily need to post in advance. I'm going to give them the person who's given it off. I'm going to give it to them because I want them. I will. I'm going to give it to them. So yeah, I was the agent. That they need to understand that it's not just the results that they get, it's also the insurance and it's also the financial. It's
Yeah.
not like, no, it's not totally just governing docs and think that they solve the problem. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
that's not the thing.
Pretty well defined in paragraph.
Right, but people are, I thought because.
No, I mean, it's a little drive.
I kept saying subdivision.
But people understand subdivision.
No, I kind of,
And I think, and it's defined in the contract, right? It's defined in the contract. It's fine in the contract.
They don't.
Anything that is-
Once, not, or you can upgrade your.
I also.
You make money in this game, but you can make them. So it's like. Yeah.
Okay, so Don, we're talking.
They are, you gotta add this.
The last person, because it's about.
Go to, tap on add fields.
But if you never bought it to start with, so. So you can't have something updated that you never had, right? So the paragraph talks about
Oh,
updated
yeah.
information.
Updated research.
Right, you can't have an updated research if you never had a.
No, you can go.
So when somebody, for whatever, like mostly if I'm signing off that we already have it.
Oh,
If somebody said they didn't want it. And is there a gap between they didn't want it and now it's needed and then haven't updated if something.
okay, so,
So it kind of would say, if they ever reword it.
Okay, so
Kind of say,
are you-
it's three.
is she signing?
A3.
Is that she? You-
Don't even
you
get
could
it.
say?
Yes, if it is needed.
Yeah, so she's signing all that because it's purple.
And the title company.
You know what I'm saying? So you gotta click on the blue for you.
As dues.
Yeah. You know what sense it was just.
Oh, the title, and we require that.
Yeah. So I messed up.
Get the offer.
But no, I think, they're doing great.
Oh, okay, so then we do that and the. If the buyer
It's
does
hard,
not
I mean-
want the information or the bid research, it's not a bid
There's so much,
The buyer seller just not pays for the cost.
that we require.
Okay, fine, so it doesn't necessarily have to be.
I think personally, all I have is like. It's money in this world is free.
Like if somebody has. Somebody has.
We just gotta think. Money is evil.
Don't try to mess it up.
It's the intention behind it. I'm just saying, like, I get caught up, when I'm making,
Previous owner had a.
yeah, like I got. I never had it. I'm like.
That he paid for it through a tax company. So now it's.
It's gotta find that rhythm and motivate it.
Say like.
Foundation. But,
When the, to be able, can the tax, is tax, like a business that does, can their lien,
it's you like to travel.
when they do.
Yeah.
When I get you the money, it's fine, the lien, and I'm like, I pay for your taxes for you. Do I still get to keep the lien on there, or do I, or is it now just a
Yeah.
contract of bad debt between you and me, like you didn't pay me back, right? You know what I mean, it's not just a bad debt. First, how did it?
And I,
It's not a real Alaska.
Alaska is in my.
Alaska,
Yeah.
okay.
Not specific, but tax.
Seals and videos and I'm like crazy about it. I've been to Dubai.
Which,
That's kind of like.
when you were talking about, like, why would it ever even say, I didn't understand your point about why it would say, which.
That's
Oh,
how-
that's-
That's how I got into.
For the paperwork.
Like,
Yeah, paragraph 11, name the.
Have you been? Yeah, you.
Right, you don't need to do that, because.
I've heard a lot of
I think I probably actually said, I think if I have, we did, I think we just said we understand that we're gonna try to use the same company.
We're in
If
it.
it's-
Only if you're assuming.
Right, because you don't need to. Why would you want to say, well, so you were saying don't do it. Some of the things.
Everyone, the normality is like, everyone has to propose. Like, it's like not even. Like, everyone does that, everyone has to drive around. I'm like, okay, this is-
And even such like we don't have, you know, like those kind of, do you like?
Do you really not want it? I'm asking to you.
Yeah, that's definitely like where the top 1% is. 100%.
And you know, they have.
I grew up- I mean, kind of like that.
Seller.
In one kind of like that. There's a lot of,
And I believe.
Don't you? Oh, you don't?
a lot of luxury. a lot
I've
of
seen three inspectors out on the same day.
Area, but I've never been to Dubai. I've never really saw it.
If I seen three inspectors out on the same day.
I-
I'll get-
Whatever I do, I get people share all of them.
Not precisely. I don't want my seller to be bound by the opinion of someone else.
See, I said that you really don't want it. I was like,
That's.
I think you really don't want it. Okay.
Whatever my dad is.
Well, I let my seller make
Yeah,
the decision.
because we're like a big. family.
Yeah.
Husband, grandfather lived in Long and
Oh,
in LA.
I feel okay.
This is Canada Island, right?
No,
I've been in California. No, I have.
You love it?
Get there, there's like ball parks. You can drive there. I went out parachute here.
You're welcome.
It's fun, see, doing good stuff.
That's it.
Thank you. Your name?
Like Sangeeta. Sangeeta, even Sangeeta. Going there because I think I grew up. That is, I mean, somebody with you, I just, my last name last month.
Yeah. So why?
Okay. Congratulations.
But I don't know. that.
Your
I
question.
don't know why,
One of the things that.
Is,
Starting off because they first.
why is lectures?
Well,
Well, I think I grew up in, you know, like I have seen that way.
But you need to understand the concept of
And that-
contracts.
No, I'm with you. I'm the same thing. I'm the same way. Well,
Who your coach.
Yeah, I saw all the different charities because of my. That's what I want.
yeah, it's like you get inspired to.
When you
Right?
stay.
You want to be like.
Stay.
And I think that's very,
And you know what? Because I just got a text from. That we went out. I was like, honestly, they're not money for me. I was coming here part time. Because, you know,
Okay.
that's what my.
Okay, so you don't have a coach.
I said, "It's around, you know, like, it's out." I don't know. Otherwise, like, what, when did you take your family, like, you have a lot of. Check.
right, it's all up.
Yeah.
See how it's do.
So you, yeah.
Jana, in the class, desiring
So
record.
I think that's,
Take.
that's why, so the reason why I got into real estate is
Several
because,
blocks. Three forks.
I mean, that is one of the reasons is to, well, I don't want to stress out on macros in a multi house.
So they, so. The.
I never really had to stress about it. Now it's already like kind of spoiled, enough. But I'm trying to learn to be more independent.
Stop all your fish.
Like a little kid in the movie, you know, you go back, royal family, like the kids. Stuff out like, or, that's like trying to do something.
I was hoping that, but yeah, like I was.
Maybe this year.
I don't want that.
Susan got all that.
Yeah.
I want it more like I want to pay the bills.
Have you done that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So like you done. With my girls.
Oh, that's.
Okay, good.
If I can see a program to get him so far, I'm gonna take it. I mean, there's no point in walking the routes. I'm gonna be taking that over, you better.
So I get there. Well, I got.
I told you. Well, I actually. And that's because. Well.
What's there about what you say?
Real estate.
You don't let us. You have to learn. Yeah, you threw it away.
So I spend weeks in summer with my kids.
A little coffee.
I.
Big guy, this big, I was like, maybe we could put these in my house.
I have kids sicker than that. I'm 22.
That's what
Yeah, so I want to.
Experiment. People you know.
But I definitely want.
Well, I'm activating now, and I'm really going to business.
Yeah, no, not right.
Oh, doing an audit.
Because it's not like when I did the filters. which
I
I
want to
tried.
Yeah, I don't want to. I didn't
I left that.
have a problem. I'll let it burn. Out that my. So that's like, that's like one of my main. And plus, I also saw out. I was doing like a lot of other things. That's like a little bit, you know, the calls, frat parties and stuff like that. There's just this point where it's like, yeah. But yeah, anyways, I didn't mean to take a picture.
No, the wall is in your bedroom. Here, my God, it's like a little, just restaurant for me on the red room inside. So, well, like on the outside, was kind of like that, or the inside. Not perfect. So I love that part, you know, like, I got to know.
Oh, what?
Right. It's fine.
More coochie with.
Then I tweet this one. I know. That's.
What about your clients today?
I would like, when I have. Right. They did.
on everything. I don't do it like this. Like, I need money.
Wow, very reasonable compliance. That's lucky to have.
I know.
Well,
Can I tell you about the?
Always go to your own business.
Oh my God. That was not me. Yeah, when I got into a car accident, not when I was working.
I know, that's
but
something.
after.
At work,
Got into a car accident. He drinks beer in a.
It's I work.
And it like, you know, whatever it is. Yeah, he always would like, it looked like it's coffee, but it's beer. But it was so funny. Because when you talk about it, you're gonna get this thing, but it's just like a transaction. Mine, elevator, it's a bigger. But. You know, it's fine. Always had that. He didn't understand the standard part.
Right.
Part of a transaction, because most people are going
Yeah, understand.
Lead generating.
People want things to be good for, if it's, there's like three things.
Okay, thank you.
Right, they're not gonna compete, so.
What did you say?
There's this one point,
Did you address this?
there's one point where he was drunk and he put,
It's a government says, you know,
he was like,
it's good that it's
he was playing,
prior to closing.
something on
Some
computer that.
fellows discover how much trouble it is.
And
Cost, they end up.
I didn't know, but I got to their house.
Why I think there needs to be some pretty-
Finance team. And, their kids.
I want invoices.
So-
I want this. And we know that it doesn't have. any-
The mom was big.
Like you
Oh,
tell me,
it's not
you
anymore.
can't- I mean, you have it here, but it doesn't.
Like in a weird way.
They don't do it.
And she.
But it's kind of like people don't realize that. So we put things in first, somebody, I'm telling you.
Yeah, what she didn't say exactly.
I mean, they have to, like, we're just, that they will. There's no penalty if they don't.
And up there.
Maybe.
So I took a picture, I'm like, yo, Ricky, what is this? And he was like, oh man, I have to shut that off. I'm like, what the heck is Jackie doing that? And now I feel, I think, I think everything. I had to get reported back, because that would be on me.
Enforceable.
I could bring
somebody willing to go.
And it's new.
Well, it's been some months, so hopefully nothing is up, but my license still is back. It's over here. It's good.
I had, under my nail, I had cancer.
Yeah.
I kind of remember it when I saw it, I was like, I now remember that. Right, you know, one from a really long time ago. Okay, so I think that one you'll be like, I was trying to mark the ones that you're getting next on this, and ones that you're something like this.
20th, literally 20th.
So I have that, I have a house that's different, well, I guess two guys I used to pay, one of them was back in state. And well, the guy that selling knew it, he selling knew it, the other one, I had this. And he was, no, I guess I didn't.
I told him, I know what.
No, but the guy sold it to the house, so people were.
Which are related.
This should be this easy, so. Send us back.
Being who?
And tell me if you don't
Fine,
like
they
it.
do.
But I don't know, right? He understands.
Everything, so we do this,
You know, that makes me like bad, I feel bad, because he's a sweet person, but then.
You mean really smart money?
And additional 8.
I know, that must be so annoying.
It's like a strict
Oh my
side.
God. And he's taking all my weekends, that's the only time he's free, he's. Until I.
Really smart. Back to the beach.
And I haven't been able to host open houses because of that.
Did he sign it?
Well, did you hear about open houses? And how that? Oh, I think we're showing it one last one. Because the interest rates are pretty high. They're about to think now 6. I
Uh-huh.
mean, it's not as,
Why is there?
it's coming, I mean, 79% was the normality before COVID, so. Just people aren't used to this kind of thing, and there's like a lot less fires regarding to it. But
That's an
if you ever need help with like,
We should go back up to the first. We said.
if you just need help, let's just like send you.
Please.
What is he looking for? And I don't need, I'm not like expecting anything in return, this is just your. So
Fire
if I find anything.
Yeah, he's not in the colony
terminating
and
an
then lit out. Area, that's about it.
Only those two
Yeah,
areas?
send it to the seller.
Colony and McKinney?
Oh,
That-
lit
but
out.
this Third page right here is not them asking for it twice.
Okay,
right?
and what's the, beds, baths, what did your family?
3+ bedroom, like whatever, 3+ bedroom, 2+ bath. He doesn't have a lot of, thing on the
That's in the
bedroom and
picture,
bathroom,
too.
but then the media room has to be big, but he doesn't have. Big small, but then it's small,
We need to say anything in that email?
Yeah, like,
Is, this is what we
like,
have from the buyer side.
like
See, that's what I'm saying, like, you would have a weird, request, and I'm like, that's crazy.
okay, so medium room, does he like want an office room or like, does he like a big garage, 3-car garage?
He has 2 big gyms, so.
He has 2 big what?
Jeep, like a big.
Oh, Jeeps.
Yeah,
Oh, that's cool. Jeep.
yeah.
Okay, so.
One of the other thing is he wants like, standard or bigger size backyard so that he can build swimming pool later. If it has swimming pool in it, it's perfect, but then if it doesn't, he's gonna build some stuff. You see, like where, now you see why he has problem finding other houses.
Because it's not gonna find one that's perfect. and that's not hard.
Exactly, and then that's like, even if it matches 95% of the time, he's like, I want 100%, that's impossible, so you have to customize it anyway, and that's how I got into buying house that doesn't have swimming pool. And it's like, okay, I'll build it myself.
How long did you guys extend this agreement? How fast you guys sell this home or find?
I have till October.
Okay, so oh wow, you gotta go fast, okay. So you're gonna have to explain to him, I'll help you, like if I find some,
Uh-huh.
I'll definitely send you some. But you gotta like tell him that the options, right, it's very scarce and this is what we can find at this moment. This is if you guys find a great deal where it matches like all of them except for one that's missing, you need to tell them how important and how rare that is in this kind of market. And it's gonna even bring up more of like a gem. You gotta make that property look like a gem, like a trophy, like something that if they miss out on this, they're going to not find something.
Oh, that happened. I actually sent him a house. It was like super pretty. Everything. It had a swimming pool. It looked modern and everything. And I sent him and he's like, I don't know. I want to think about it. He was thinking for like 2 days. House was gone.
It was what?
He was like thinking for 2 days and then the house was gone. Like it's sold and now he's like, that was the only house I like. I'm like, I told you.
Did you get upset?
He did get upset.